Okay, welcome to our online students. We're just about to do a little reflection. So I might just briefly show you the class because last time you were all very interested to know who was here. Give a wave. We're a small group here, face to face, but a very warm, vigorous, academically outstanding group here. So I'm going to read once again from the Jewish sacred texts, a couple of old texts, textual traditions that actually appear in a lot of faith traditions. These kinds of texts appear in most sacred texts from different religions. Not exactly the same, but the creation narratives are common amongst many. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless, void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. While a wind, a breath, ruach, life, swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. I'm going to read you another creation narrative, also from the Hebrew Bible. And this one comes from Proverbs chapter 8. If I can find it. And this is written from the perspective of wisdom. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soils, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him, like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. That was wisdom talking. I thought those two ancient traditions would be a good place for us to begin because they paint pictures for us of kind of prehistoric imaginings of what the very beginnings of life were. And what strikes me in particular is that when God creates life, God is essentially making space for other to be. So God is no longer, if God ever was. But according to these traditions, when God creates, God enters into a kind of dynamic, creative relationship with something other than God's self. And that takes humility. To create space for the other. And so I begin there today because we are going to be talking about what it means to listen to those who live with experiences of abuse and trauma. And one of the key elements of our learning today will be to dwell on the question of what is the difference between listening and fixing? What's the difference between listening and fixing? Do you know what I mean when I ask that question? Does anyone want to reflect on the readings or the invitation today? For me, particularly in the Proverbs account, from the very beginning, divine life creates wisdom and then proceeds to create with wisdom. So God has this creative companion. So from the very roots of the way we understand God to be, we have these signals, these symbols, as it were, beautiful poetic metaphors of a God who wants to dance and play and create with other living things and is prepared to move over so that the other has space to come into being and be there in and of itself. I've called this kenosis, kenotic humility. Kenosis means to empty oneself. And in this case, in the sense of kenosis as a spirit of creative life, kenosis means being prepared to empty the space of oneself. So to stand present in a way that enables space for others to come into being. Now, in my view, this is core to what we mean when we talk about spiritual care. I've just been at a meeting this morning of chaplains and chaplaincy organisations and various different places that provide usually Christian chaplaincy in various contexts. And it's really, really interesting to hear in the conversation the different notions of what chaplains do, what they're supposed to do. And I would suggest that what is prevalent actually out there on the ground in chaplaincy land is a confusion about what chaplaincy is, or what pastoral care is, or what spiritual care is. It is often therapy plus religion. So therapeutic tools plus religious narratives, sort of tacked together, sewn together somehow. And I think that is symptomatic of the fact that spiritual carers are actually struggling to work out in themselves what it is they do. So they appeal to psychology for the toolbox. And so that's what makes me useful in the workplace. But because I'm a chaplain, I need to bring the spiritual side in, so I just tack my religious narrative onto the toolbox. Now that's a simplified version. There are many, many different people out there doing chaplaincy in various ways, and some of them doing a stunningly good job. I would suggest that one of the key criteria is that we are able to listen deeply with kenotic humility. We are actually not present to others as their saviour, as their rescuer. We are not there to create a kind of messianic reliance of them on us. We're not their Messiah. We're there to listen. And listening doesn't just mean listening to their narrative. Listening means creating this space of kenotic humility in which we hold them and with them enable them to listen deeply to themselves and discover their own spiritual resources in order to tackle whatever situation it is that they're in. Life. It could just be normal life. But particularly in the situation of abuse and trauma, right at the end of this book, Bessel van der Kolk writes that quote that I shared with you last week, that the healing is going to come about when we are able to embrace ourselves, accept ourselves, and affirm that the way we have developed is actually okay. Even though it might be profoundly painful, I don't need to judge myself for it. I need to listen more deeply to how I got here, what happened to me, and how I draw on myself, my own resources, in order to grow and expand and change and continue and live in and through those circumstances. All of that stuff comes from people themselves. Human beings are complex, wondrous, irreducible beings, and they are resilient, as van der Kolk says. We are resilient. And we do each other a disservice when we try and rescue one another. We deeply care for one another when we stay present, we companion one another while we do our own work and establish ourselves as strong, living, healthy selves in relationship. Some people question the focus on self in listening because they think it's too focused on the ego, or it too overtly, or it raises the profile of the individual over and against the collective. That human beings are not just individuals; they're a collective, relational, social reality, and that's true. But in order to be a social reality, they need to be individuals, strong, healthy, self-determining individuals in relationship. And relationship doesn't mean handing over your subjectivity to another person in order to allow them to define who you are. Healthy individual is a person who's able to own their own stuff, live in their own stuff, make decisions out of their own stuff, hear other people, respond to other people, relate with other people, but not defer responsibility for themselves to the other. And nor is it our responsibility as listeners to take another person's subjectivity from them and define for them what their path to healing is. That's not our role. Comments? Questions?
Does it mean that by listening, I am putting myself into, like you mentioned, validate, and also giving the affirmation to the person? Is that correct?
Yes, that's part of it, absolutely. Now we don't, I think the affirmation side of things is interesting, and I would recommend that you go and read Carl Rogers, the great existential psychologist. You've read him twice, have you? All of his stuff twice? Yeah. Wow, you're amazing. You've done better than I have. He speaks of unconditional positive regard, which which is kind of a catch-all phrase for a very beautifully complex approach to the human person. And in that, he doesn't mean affirming every destructive element that manifests itself in a person. So if a person's behaviour is destructive in some way, you don't affirm destructive behaviour, but you affirm the human being in front of you. You don't dismiss the human being because of the destructive behaviour. You just listen more deeply. And your underlying assumption is that the human being in front of you is a beautiful, love-worthy, life-worthy, complex, irreducible human person. And you regard them in that way. Now, you've probably got more nuanced reflections on that, Fran.
Can I share what the creation story from my own tradition?
You can.
How that
Thank you.
fits
Yeah.
into this?
Yeah. Do you mind if I turn the camera on to you?
So in my Church of One, to me, the beginning, it's very similar. In the beginning, there was the void, which is still there, which is, for me, is Brahman. And the beginning of the world came about from God's desire to express the love that is that void. So to me, the universe, the cosmos, the everything is love, which can only be expressed through something manifest. And so this universe was manifest as a way of expressing love.
Beautiful.
And so that's my kind of starting point. And the whole Hindu idea of Shiva and Shakti together. Shiva is the consciousness, and Shakti is the energy of movement and manifestation. Is kind of similar to what you were saying in different kinds of words. But for me, the kenotic humility, the listening is everything in this cosmos is an expression of love. And for me, when I go to see somebody, I have a little mantra that I say, which is, may I be a conduit for the expression of the love and healing of the divine. So it's not the ego, it's not going into myself, it's allowing that conduit to let the universe express the love that it is. And so the listening is actually enabling the person to hear themselves and to become conscious of the expression of love that they are.
Beautiful. Yep. And I can hear the resonances in the way you're expressing that with what we're talking about in terms of kenotic humility. Yeah.
So
Thank you for that.
Can you just clarify which tradition do you follow?
That's an evolving thing, but it's the Dharmic tradition. So the Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, kinds of back when it was forming. So not so much the modern Hinduism.
So which deity do you wear?
Kuan Yin.
Kunyam.
Kuan Yin, yeah.
The Kuan Yin.
Buddhist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Is the what I
The
call
female
the Ishta
version.
Devata, that
Yeah.
is my,
The goddess of mercy.
that I don't see as a goddess. I don't see her in her female form as a goddess. I see her as the part of me that I most aspire to express. She's the goddess, or he was the god of unlimited compassion and love, and that's the part of me that I most aspire to express. not seen as a God.
Thank you. I think it's beautiful that we're having these beautiful multi-faith, multi-spiritual conversations here. Now, I want you to consider this challenging quote. Distrust compassion. Prefer dignity for yourself and others. I'm not going to tell you who said it yet, although I might have already told you at some stage, because that'll just colour your view, maybe. I'll tell you afterwards. Distrust compassion. What? Prefer dignity for yourself and others. Now, why would you distrust compassion? Now, just listen carefully. He's not saying don't show any compassion any time. Really what he's saying is be cautious. When compassion is in the room, be cautious. Don't trust it, which means it has the capacity to trip us up or deceive us about ourselves. What do you think he means when he says that? What is the risk inherent in compassion as a form of listening, particularly when it comes to trauma? Why do you say power?
Because compassion can be. I feel sorry for you in your not as goodness as other people, or in your poor choices, or in your bad situation, so there's all this judgment in it where I'm here looking at you and making a judgment about whether you need compassion, whether you, condescension. It can be.
Yeah.
It can accidentally have an agenda,
Yep.
and the agenda can be to fix rather than to keep a peer relationship.
Yep.
One of the readings mentioned something about competence was important
Yeah.
in trauma, and compassion can steal competence.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
That's good.
I have a story actually.
Yeah, go for it.
Every 8 weeks at our church, we do community projects. One of the projects that I was going to was sewing sanitary pads that got shipped overseas to people that could afford them. And I brought one of my daughters with me once. She was 21 and we were sewing away, and she said, "This is all wrong." I was like, "What?" She said, "It's all wrong. They shouldn't be sitting there waiting for ladies in the West. Someone needs to go and teach those girls how to sew, and they can make their own products, have their own small businesses, and they're not dependent on us." And I said, "Oh, that hurts my brain." She actually does that now, so she went along and compassion. We were compassionate in our sewing, but it meant the people were kept independent.
Yeah.
Right. It's an unintended consequence, isn't it? Because, I mean, what does compassion actually mean? What does the word mean?
Feel me. So
Pretty close, yeah. Companion. So, companion means to break bread with. Passion actually means suffer. So to suffer with, which is it's a core kind of value in many, many spiritualities and religious traditions, isn't it? And it means to share the human condition. How could that possibly be a bad thing? You know. And so perhaps what Christopher Hitchens is getting at, and it is Christopher Hitchens, is that in our human attempt to live alongside and with one another in the midst of limitedness, we can too easily fall into the traps of building codependencies and reducing individual dignity and agency, which is why he says prefer dignity. Now, what is dignity? When I say that word, what comes to the fore for you?
I think it's like giving the other person worth in and of themselves without anything else around them, that they are a worthy person.
Yep.
No matter what their situation or what other people around them or what they can do.
intrinsic worth.
Building on that, intrinsic potential.
Right. Yeah. Yep. So the person who appears to be crippled by post-traumatic stress disorder could so easily become our personal little project, couldn't they? You know, I'm the chaplain, or I'm the spiritual care practitioner, and so down there has, crippling anxiety related to post-traumatic stress, and they need me. So I visit them every second day, and I do good spiritual care there, because if it wasn't for me being there, and not many people say this explicitly, but there's then that person wouldn't be able to express their faith. We go deep together, and that's and they need that. They wouldn't have the opportunity to go deep together if I didn't turn up. And this can be really, really implicit, almost to the point where we can't detect it in ourselves. Which is why our practice is a reflective practice. We've got to be monitoring ourselves all the time for this stuff. Now, in situations of abuse and trauma, this is so important. It cannot be more profoundly underlined. And I think it's pretty much the thesis of this book too, that when we are listening with people who have been abused and who are living either with disorders relating to trauma or who are wrestling with resilient growth through trauma, it is paramount that they be facilitated in their own agency, their own capacity. And that's why the body is so important. Recognition of the whole organism, because it's in the actual being and doing of existence that we reshape, that we express resilience, that we free ourselves from the constraints of fight, flight, freeze mechanisms, unfettered. Now we're going to do a little activity, as I said, shortly, that's going to invite us to sort of kind of hopefully expand our listening skills a bit and think a bit differently about listening, particularly in the abuse and trauma space. But before we do, comments, questions, reflections?
What do you mean by dignity for yourself and others? What do you mean, the others?
Well, I didn't write that. Christopher Hitchens wrote it. So I can only tell you what I think he might have meant. But that is that in any truly spiritually caring encounter, you have a minimum of 2 human beings. And both are present. And neither should divest themselves of agency in that listening encounter. Both should remain fully and healthily themselves. So and this is where the Christian tradition is problematic for us as listeners on a number of fronts. Because we have at the core of our narrative a man who laid down his life for the sins of the world. Okay? Now we know many of us know what we think we understand, know what we think we might understand about that. But it's kind of like compassion in that it holds within it a real risk for our interpersonal behaviour. And we know that Christian communities, and I don't know what your experience is, Fran, but you might want to share this, that churches can be full of people running around laying down their lives for everyone else, burning out, frustrated, losing their faith, you know, because they are somehow slavishly caught up in a misunderstanding of what it meant for Jesus to lay down his life for others.
I could share a story.
Share a story, Fran.
In one episode of my life, I have lived up in the Kimberley,
Yep.
working for the Bishop of Broome
Okay, yeah.
and Catholic Bishop of Broome, and we established an electrical contracting business inside the diocese. Part of the diocese business was our little business, and we lived in one of the church properties, and we had a volunteer who came up to the Kimberley to work, and he lived in another of the church buildings on the same block as us, and we got to be friends. And he told us one day that he had asked, he was living in the old kindergarten, and he had asked the bishop if he could get some curtains on his bedroom windows, because he was on the corner of a quite busy intersection, and at night when he was getting undressed, he was conscious that people could see him in his bedroom. And the bishop said no, because he had come to the Kimberley to work in the service of God in a spirit of sacrifice.
Okay, yeah.
And that in the same sense that Jesus sacrificed himself on our behalf, he felt that it was pretty selfish of this guy to be demanding curtains. So the woman who worked for him as finance manager got some material from the spinning shop, sewed him some curtains in her home, cost the church nothing, and she got severely chastised for the fact that she had done that.
There you go. And those kinds of stories abound in all of our religious traditions and faith traditions.
It was the spirit of sacrifice that he was breaking.
Now, what's the best kind of sacrifice on the other end of the spectrum, if there is an end of a spectrum, on another part of the spectrum? How might offering oneself be a good, healthy thing? I think Jesus tried to articulate it when he said, love your neighbour as you love yourself. There was no sense in which actually when offering oneself you subjugate yourself in any way. You don't become the doormat in that sense.
I think the finance manager was a lovely example of it. She gave up several nights of her free time.
She
to
actually
sew
asserted
curtains
herself.
and asserted
that sense.
herself in the process.
That's right. Okay, thank you, Fran. Now, I want us to do some listening to each other, but we're not going to use words. Can I have a volunteer, please? Thank you, Alan. So just stand over there for the time being. Can I have another volunteer?
Okay.
Okay, thanks, James. So I've got two blokes. That's all right. Now, I want us to think metaphorically of this area here as the listening space. This is the space here that James is going to create for Alan and hold for Alan. Okay, so you're going to be the listener in this context. So in a sense, this is your space because you have created it by offering to listen. Yeah. But you're going to interact with this space in a particular way. You're providing this space for another. So can I invite you to stand pretty much here where I'm standing. And you might might want to sort of just become accustomed to this space. You might want to hold your arms out, or however you want to sort of acknowledge that this is a space that you're going to be holding for someone else. People do this in all kinds of ways. But yeah. And then I want to invite you to invite Alan to step into the space.
Alan, you might come
Oh,
inside.
yeah. Sure.
Feel free.
Yeah.
Now notice where Alan has situated himself. That's okay, it's up to him. He can put himself wherever he wants to put himself in the space. We don't know why Alan's put himself there. You don't need to justify yourself, mate, it's all right. You've just chosen to stand there, and that's okay. Now, James, I want you to move yourself into a position where you are directly facing Alan, perhaps pretty much where I am. You might want to be a bit closer, so I'm going to walk over here. And face James. There you go. Now, Alan, because I'm teaching you the game, I'll direct it for the time being. I want you to make movements and facial expressions as they occur to you. And James, I want you to pay very, very careful attention to Alan, and as if you were his mirror, move and change your facial expressions and your position in exactly the same way as Alan does, at exactly the same time, if that is possible. Okay?
Only facial. Only facial, is it?
No, whole body. So for example, if I'm standing here, so James is already paying attention to me. Okay? Get the picture? Okay. Stay with him. We're going to do this for about 2 minutes. Okay. Thank you. What was that like? Stay where you are. What was that like, James?
I had to pay attention to him, all these movement.
Yeah.
I had to pay keen attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have to concentrate? Pretty
Yes,
much?
yes.
Yeah.
Concentrate, yeah.
Alan, what was it like for you to have someone who was paying close attention to you in that way?
Wow. Initially, I didn't really think of that, but then
Yeah.
after a while, I said, "Oh, you are copying me."
Yeah. That's right.
Right. And that made me a bit, conscious.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in a way, directly very conscious that you are really paying attention to my movement.
Mm.
Yeah.
Was it a, how would you describe it in terms of energy output for you? Was it a tiring thing for you to do, or was
Yeah, it's not easy. But internal strain, I use a lot of concentration,
Yeah.
full attention.
Okay. Now I'm going to challenge you to do it again for another few minutes, and I want to see if you can reduce your reaction time.
Okay.
Okay. Because throughout that couple of minutes, yep, you were pretty good at mimicking, but all of your actions came maybe, I don't know, what do you reckon?
Yeah.
Half a second or a second afterwards. Now, you may or may not be able to reduce, but I'm going to invite you to attempt to reduce. Okay? Yep. Sorry, I shouldn't be chuckling. Thank you very much. Now stay there. All right, now swap.
Swap.
Alan, you are now listening to James.
You got to break.
It's all right. Just, that's
It
fine.
doesn't capture him.
All right. Oh, okay. Yeah.
You may want to come nearer.
Can I do it fast?
You move fast or slow, or you don't have to stand in one position. You do whatever you. Now, Alan, was there any point in time where you felt challenged by James's movements in yourself?
Yeah. Yes.
Where was that?
When the movement is more like just now.
Trying to get down. How does he get down that far?
Because to James is so natural, but at the time I was trying to couldn't get it. Yeah, so that was
So
a
in
big
paying
challenge.
close attention to James, you were aware of yourself
Yeah,
and
that's
things that
true.
were happening in you. as
That's
well.
true.
So even though all of your attention
The focus on
is
the
on the other,
yeah.
you are still present.
That's true.
And you feel the movements of the other in yourself as you track with them.
Yeah.
All right, I'll release you two. You may go back to your seats. Fran and Linda, your turn.
My turn.
Yeah. Fran, you can be the listener. Linda, you can come into Fran's space. So, Fran, you're receiving Linda and paying attention to her.
Would you like a chair? No, you can find it.
feel, Fran?
Intentional, quite very, that it needed a lot of intention to stay, to be with. Yeah. And at one stage I went from mirroring to not mirroring to
Yeah.
doing this, because when you do Pilates you do the,
Yeah.
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 So I went into, and I was conscious of that.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of morphed into your own.
I went into the follow the Pilates same arm thing
Yeah.
rather than the mirror thing,
Yeah.
and I was conscious of that.
So you felt your own stuff asserting itself in the
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
And your response to yourself in that was.
To just recognise that's what I was
Yep.
doing.
You became aware of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And just kind of, oh well, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
still here.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but I'm still here.
Yeah. Melinda, what was that like for you?
You became aware of various stiffness sort of areas when you're actually having to move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you become aware of yourself in a different way.
Yep.
Not necessarily a way you might expect to become aware of yourself
No.
in a spiritual care listening sort of sense. Yeah. Which,
And I was very aware of you
mm,
as you.
mm,
Yeah.
mm.
Not just the role play, but I was very aware of
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. All right, swap around. Linda, you hold the space for Fran for a few minutes and see how you go.
Where would you like to be?
You was good.
Beautiful. Okay. What's that like for you?
Friends are very fluid, so it
Yeah.
was easy to kind of anticipate where
Okay.
she might go next.
But the point
So-
is, you were anticipating, and which is a form of presence in that sense to Fran. Yeah, good. Yeah.
And I felt like you were moving with me. I just felt like there was a presence there moving with me,
Yeah,
like a shadow.
yeah. Good. Okay. Katie, your turn. Did you think you were going to get away with that, didn't you? Yeah. All right. You and I can do it. And you can hold space for me if you like. So I'll move and you can mirror around.
us together this long.
Katie, when I was being still, were you able to lower your concentration or your attention in any way?
I don't think so. I think you just concentrate on different things because you notice the more fine movements.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you were still as present to me while I was being still as
Yeah.
when you was trying to, mimic my movements.
Yeah.
And so on. Yeah, okay. So the attention of the holder of the space is always there. The person you're listening to may descend into deep silence and stillness, and you might take that as an opportunity to light up a cigarette, whatever. No,
Probably not.
no. You are paying attention all the way through, because that person is being present in the space you are holding, in the way that they wish to be at that time. It's their agency. And your capacity to be comfortable with their quietness and their silence is paramount to paying attention. Yeah.
And you could see, Kate, you could see your attention in that stillness.
Yeah.
You could see it was still just as much there.
Yeah.
It's
All right, I'm going to subject myself to the holding space now. So I will hold this space for you. Okay.
It feels weird watching someone like move your actions.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that, because so many people, the first time someone really pays attention to you, it's kind of a weird experience. Because it actually doesn't happen to us very often.
Yeah.
Even our most intimate family members don't always pay that much attention to us. And so when we are intentionally invited into a space where we become the one who is invited to be fully in the space, and the person who's holding the space enables that in us by staying close and paying attention to us, that's a weird experience. Yeah.
It reminds me of this exercise video I was watching by someone called James Finley, who's like a trauma person.
Yeah.
He talks about the circles of suffering.
Right.
And how we have to step into the person's suffering but still have 1 foot outside, so we're grounded in knowing how we're feeling about that.
Yep.
So we're not engulfed by it, we're not
Beautiful.
detached.
Yep, fantastic.
Yeah.
So we're present
That's
with 1 foot in with the person, and we're present to
With
ourselves with 1 foot out. We're here, we're holding the space, but we're here as ourselves. I don't step in here and through my misplaced compassion try to sort of somehow embody your suffering in myself or any of that sort of stuff. We've got this strong, healthy relatedness. If I try and become you or carry you or rescue you, we're actually not relating as equals anymore. Where I'm seeking to rescue you and you're letting me do it or whatever. You're laying yourself, and so that there's no equity in that sense. There's no mutuality. Mutuality is paramount in this listening space. And look, it's this stuff is basic to all spiritual care. In fact, it's basic to all of the listening professions. But doing it in this kind of physical space, particularly in response to abuse and trauma, helps us to remember that there's actually a literal element to this too in our listening to abuse and trauma. That when we invite someone into the space that we've created for them, when they're in this situation, we are not just listening to a narrative or an experience. We're listening to this whole organism who in many, many ways will express themselves through the way they move, the way they breathe, the way they tense or relax their muscles. We're listening to all of it. It took me a while to get used to my own spiritual director, who was wonderful. I don't see her anymore, but the best spiritual director I've ever had. I often noticed her scanning my body. And it was a bit kind of... She explained to me what she was doing. She said, I'm paying attention. She said, because every movement you make throughout the 1 hour that you are sitting here in this space is a movement that speaks to me of you. So that's part of it, and that's so important with trauma. It's time for a cuppa. Well done, Katie. Thank you. I'll pause the video.